Welcome to Secret Mirage, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Narrated by Richard Pulsifer. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. Darrell couldn't escape the haunting image of a woman's face. It was there, flickering in the dying embers of the campfire, lurking in the shadows beyond. As the day surrendered to the silent night, memories of a distant past flooded his mind. He thought of his hometown of Peoria, of a woman he loved and lost, of the regret that gnawed at him. Darrell roamed the desert alone, searching for gold and solace, relishing the desolate landscape that matched his mood. Suddenly a sound shattered the stillness. Darrell strained to hear, his burro motionless beside him. The wind picked up, scattering ash and smoke into the darkness. A coyote's cry pierced the night, but it was no ordinary howl. It was the mournful song of a wolf, a creature like Darrell, longing for companionship in the barren wilderness. The cry echoed in Darrell's heart, a reminder of his own loneliness. As he reached for his gun, Darrell heard a clink of metal and the soft thud of hooves on sand. He stepped back into the shadows, alert to the dangers that lurked in the borderlands of Sonora and Arizona. Two figures emerged from the darkness, a white man and a heavily laden burro. Darrell watched them warily, unsure of their intentions. "Hey there," the man called out, coming to a halt and scanning his surroundings. "I saw your fire. Mind if I camp here?" Darrell emerged from the shadows to greet his visitor, whom he assumed was a fellow prospector. Though he was annoyed at the interruption to his solitary vigil, Darrell knew the rules of the desert and welcomed the stranger. The man thanked him and began unpacking his supplies to prepare a meal. His movements were slow and precise, catching Darrell's interest despite his initial irritation. As the campfire grew brighter, Darrell could see that the man's gray hair didn't make him seem old, and his hunched posture didn't detract from his rugged appearance. "You find any minerals?" Darrell asked after a while. The stranger looked up, startled by the sound of another human voice. They exchanged a few words, but the stranger seemed to prefer silence. Darrell understood that and couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this man. They were both desert wanderers, driven by something more than just the search for gold. Darrell felt a deep, unexplainable bond between them, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a sensation so old and forgotten that he couldn't even name it. But it was a feeling akin to pain. When he woke up, Darrell was surprised to find that his companion had left while he was sleeping. A trail in the sand led off to the north, where there was no water. Darrell shrugged his shoulders and decided it wasn't his problem. He had his own issues to deal with. He quickly forgot about his strange visitor and started his day, grateful for the solitude that surrounded him. The canyon was furrowed and cactus-spired with no signs of life. Darrell traveled southwest without straying too far from the dry stream bed, hunting for signs of gold in a desultory way without much eagerness. The work was toilsome, but he took periods of rest not because he was tired, but to observe and feel what the vast, silent world meant to him. It had always been a mystical thing, which he felt in all its incalculable power but never understood. While he was digging for water in a moist, white-bordered wash, he was abruptly interrupted by the crack of hard hooves on stone. Down the canyon came a man and a burro, and Darrell recognized them. "Hey, friend," called the man, halting. "Our trails crossed again, that's good." "Hello," replied Darrell slowly. "Any mineral sign today?" "No." They set up camp together, eating their simple meal and smoking their pipes in silence. They rolled themselves up in their blankets, not saying much before drifting off to sleep. The next morning they remained quiet and distant with each other. However, when Darrell was about to leave after packing his burro, his companion turned to him and suggested they stay together. "I don't usually have a partner," Darrell replied. His companion responded calmly, "You're alone, I'm alone. It's a vast place. If we find gold, there'll be enough for both of us." Darrell retorted, "I'm not going down into the desert for gold alone." His companion's eyes glimmered with a unique spark. Darrell realized that he had never met a man who could withstand the extreme heat, blinding dust storms, and desolate wilderness of the desert as well as he could. With a grand gesture, Darrell motioned towards the vast expanse of desert and mountains before them. "I might make my way through the Sonora Desert, or perhaps head up north towards the Colorado Basin. Pinacate could also be an option," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. His companion, an older man, replied, "I don't know the land like you do, but it doesn't matter much to me where we go." He paused, his gaze taking in the stunning view before them. "I may be old and lonely, but I can still travel, and maybe for a few days I can keep you company." Darrell nodded. "Sure, have it your way." Together they embarked on a slow descent into the desert, setting up camp at sunset under the protection of a low mesa. The elder man's silence was a comfort to Darrell, who appreciated the peacefulness of the desert. As they traveled further into the wilderness, the older man began to open up and share his thoughts. Darrell was surprised at how different he was from anyone he had ever met in the wilds. Despite the heat, sand, and meager provisions, the older man never complained. He was always busy during the day and spent his nights pacing or lost in thought. Darrell's curiosity was piqued, and he found himself drawn to the man's quiet strength and resilience. He realized that he had been avoiding companionship for years, and this journey was slowly changing him. During those years, only 3 men had ventured into the desert with Darrell. Unfortunately, all 3 had perished, their bones left to bleach in the unforgiving sands. Darrell had never sought to uncover their secrets, but the latest addition to their group had piqued his interest. As Darrell's obsession with reaching the silent, desolate unknown grew stronger, he had forgotten that other men, too, faced their own struggles. However, his silent comrade reminded him of this fact. One afternoon, after traversing a treacherous path of sand and gravel, the 2 men stumbled upon a dry water hole. Darrell attempted to dig for water, but his efforts proved fruitless. Just as he was about to give up, his companion produced a small, forked branch from his pack. He gripped the prongs of the branch and held it out in front of him, with the end pointing straight ahead. He then began to walk along the stream bed. At first Darrell found this behavior amusing, but as he watched in amazement as the branch began to quiver and turn, he felt a sense of pity for his comrade. Eventually the end of the branch pointed downward, and the prospector instructed Darrell to dig in that spot. Darrell was incredulous. Had the man lost his mind? But he stood by as his comrade dug deeper and deeper into the sand until water began to seep through at the 6-foot mark. The prospector instructed Darrell to retrieve a small basket from his pack, and they were finally able to quench their thirst. Darrell couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He had felt a powerful magnetic force emanating from the branch, and it had led them to water. As they continued their journey, Darrell couldn't help but wonder what other secrets his comrade might be hiding. Darrell did as his comrade instructed and watched as the basket was dropped into the deep hole, preventing the sides from caving in and allowing water to seep through. As he observed, the basket began to fill with water. Out of all the strange events that had occurred during his time in the desert, this was the most peculiar. He picked up a peach branch, mimicking his comrade's actions, but it was lifeless in his hands. "I see you don't have it," his comrade remarked. "Few men do." "What do you mean?" Darrell asked. "Some men have a power to find water that way. Back in Illinois, an old German used to do that to locate wells. He showed me I had the same power. I can't explain it, but it's not supernatural." "So you mean some men have a magnetism, a force or power to find water as you did?" "Yes, it's not uncommon on farms back in Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The old German I mentioned made money traveling around with his pitchfork." "What a gift for a man in the desert!" Darrell exclaimed. For the most part, they followed the course of a wash, one on each side, letting their burros travel at a leisurely pace while they searched the canyons and under ledges for signs of gold. When they found any rocks that hinted at the presence of gold, they picked off a piece and tested it chemically. The search was enthralling. They broke up their work with moments of rest, gazing out at the vast stretches and smoky shingles to the line of dim mountains. Some inexplicable desire, not just the lure of gold, drove them to the top of mesas and escarpments where they rested and took in the expansive view. As the sun began to set, casting a red glow across the distant mountains, they decided to take a break in a cool canyon or dry wash to search for water. Once they found it, they unloaded their supplies and gave their tired burros a drink before setting them free to roam. They used dead mesquite to build a fire and sat against the rocks, watching the embers slowly fade. Eventually, they lay down on the sandy ground, their faces illuminated by the bright stars above. Over the following days and nights, Darrell found himself increasingly drawn to his companion. Despite the grueling work they endured, he felt as though he was growing closer to the man. In the city or mining camps, he had always felt restless and unhappy, but out in the vast desert he found a sense of peace that he had never known before. He believed that the harsh conditions of the wilderness could bring out the best or worst in people. Some might become savage and lose their humanity, but others could become noble and almost superhuman. Darrell couldn't shake the feeling that he and his companion were there for a reason, brought together by some mysterious force. As they worked side by side, he was humbled by the other man's selflessness. Try as he might, Darrell couldn't keep him from doing more than his share of the work. Despite their differences, he felt a growing sense of kinship with this stranger on the desert. The man was quiet, soft-spoken, and gentle, but beneath his calm exterior lay an unyielding strength. Darrell could not deter him from his mission, which was to find gold not for himself, but for Darrell. Darrell himself was always excited at the prospect of discovering gold, but the man showed no emotion whatsoever. One evening the two of them were camping at the head of a canyon, and the heat from the rocks persisted even after sundown. A desert bird sang a mournful tune, and a distant coyote wailed. The stars shone bright until the full moon rose and extinguished their light. It was on this night that Darrell finally asked his companion what had driven him into the desert. "Partner, what brings you out here?" he asked. "Do I seem like a man who is driven?" the man replied. "No, but I can feel it. Are you here to forget?" Darrell asked. "Yes," the man answered softly. Darrell didn't say anything else, but watched as the man got up and began pacing back and forth, lost in his own thoughts. He didn't look up at the stars or the moon, but kept his head down and his feet moving. It was as if he was in another world, a world that only the lonely desert could make real. Darrell was struck by the man's helplessness, and he himself became acutely aware of the pain in his own heart and the torment of his passion-driven soul. He had come to the desert to remember a woman. As he gazed into the vast expanse of the desert, Darrell couldn't help but remember the first time he had laid eyes on her. She had been a vision of beauty, tall, slender, with golden hair, blue eyes, and red lips, and he had never been able to forget her. But now, looking back, he felt a sickening remorse clawing at his heart. He rose from his seat and made his way out of the canyon, climbing up to the top of a mesa. From there he gazed out into the mystic shadows of the desert, his mind wandering back to the past. The moon shone down on him, casting its radiant light across the landscape, while the stars glittered serenely in the sky above. It was a sight to behold, the very essence of divinity. The desert was all around him, silent and austere, a chaos of rock and sand that seemed to stretch out into infinity. And yet in its desolate beauty Darrell saw a certain kind of spirit, a soul that spoke to him in ways he couldn't explain. He felt as though he were a part of it all, a tiny atom in a vast universe, but somehow necessary to an inscrutable purpose. As he stood there, basking in the silence and stillness of the desert, Darrell felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was as though the phantoms of the past had finally been laid to rest, and he was free to move forward into the future. And so he returned to camp, seeking solace in the company of his comrade. "I reckon we're two of a kind," he said. "It was a woman who drove me into the desert, but I come to remember, the desert's the only place I can do that." "Was she your wife?" asked the elder man. "No," replied Darrell, his voice heavy with emotion. And so they sat in silence, two men bound together by the memories of the past and the vast expanse of the desert that lay before them. A refreshing breeze blew through the canyon, causing the dry sand to sift through the sagebrush and driving away the lingering heat. The campfire slowly burned down until it was nothing but a pile of ruddy ash. "I had a daughter," Darrell's friend spoke up. "Her mother died during childbirth, and I didn't know how to raise a girl. She was beautiful and carefree. It's the same old story." These words struck a chord with Darrell. They made him uneasy. He had been consumed by his own guilt and had long forgotten about anyone connected to the girl he had wronged. But the consequences of his actions had far-reaching effects, striking at the very foundation of a home. Here in the desert he saw a man wasting away because he couldn't forget, because he had nothing left to live for. Darrell now understood why his friend was drawn to the desert. "Please tell me more," he urged. "It's the same old story. My daughter was beautiful and free-spirited. The young men were always chasing after her. I think she enjoyed the attention. I was away a lot, working in another town. She fell in love with a wild guy, and I didn't find out until it was too late. He promised to marry her, but he never showed up. When the truth came out, my daughter left home and headed west. Eventually, I received word from her. She was doing well, working hard to provide for her baby. It was a long time before I had any news from her again. I had no ties and decided to head west myself. Her lover had also moved west. In those days, everyone was heading west. I tried to track him down, intent on killing him, but I lost his trail and couldn't find my daughter either. She had moved on, haunted by her past. Ever since then, I've been living off the land, searching for gold in the desert," said Simon. Darrell's voice sounded tense and strained as he spoke. "You know, it's the same old story, but somehow even sadder." "Partner, where did you come from in Illinois?" Darrell inquired. "Peoria," Simon replied. "And your name?" Darrell asked in a husky tone. "Simon Evans Simon," came the response. The sound of that name hit Darrell like a bullet. He stood motionless, as if he had been shot straight through the heart. Memories flooded his mind like blinding flashes of lightning, and he became a quivering, terror-stricken man. He mumbled something hoarsely and backed into the shadows. However, he had no reason to fear being discovered, even though his agitation might have given him away. Simon sat brooding over the campfire, lost in thought. Darrell walked away swiftly into the darkness, his blood rushing thickly in his ears. He whispered to himself over and over again, "Merciful God, Mona was his daughter." Chapter 2. Darrell was consumed by a flood of emotions as he tried to comprehend what was happening. It was unbelievable that two complete strangers could end up in the desert because of their shared memories of the same woman. It brought back memories that were buried deep within him, making him realize how his past governed his present. For Darrell, the only thing that mattered was wandering in secluded places where he could keep his secrets safe from prying eyes. But fate had thrown him a curveball by putting him face to face with the father of the woman he had wronged. It was unfathomable and terrifying, and something that both the father and Darrell's lover would have found unbearable. The pain that Darrell felt was so deep that it drove him to the brink of despair. He wanted to reveal his true identity to Simon, but he knew that it would lead to his death. However, it wasn't the fear of dying that tortured him. It was the agony of keeping his secret buried deep inside. The fear of death no longer plagued him, but the thought of causing more suffering to a man who had already endured so much was unbearable to Darrell. He made a vow to himself to not add to Simon's troubles or let him become a murderer. Darrell decided to come clean about the tragic story of Mona and himself and try to make things right. As he pondered these thoughts, his attention turned to Mona's daughter, who was somewhere beyond the horizon. During his lonely nights by the campfire, he had imagined Mona's fate, but he now realized that his imagination had been wrong. Mona had overcome her struggles and was fighting for her child's happiness. Darrell felt a shuddering sensation within him, a new awareness that changed him profoundly. As he gazed out at the vast, blood-red desert, he finally understood its grandeur, simplicity, and truth. He had learned the lesson it taught. His meeting and journey with Simon were no longer strange to him, for they had followed the same destiny and fate. The desert had brought them together after years of wandering alone, searching for something. Now their paths had crossed, leading them towards a common goal. Darrell suddenly realized that he had been given a gift, the gift of sight. With this realization, he felt a strong urge to help his fellow traveler, Simon. As he made his way back to camp, he pondered on how he could assist Simon with his burden. In the stillness of the night, Simon could be seen pacing back and forth in the darkness. Darrell lay awake, thinking of a plan. The next morning, as Simon prepared the burros for their journey, Darrell broke the silence. He told Simon that his story from the previous night had made him think. He then proceeded to tell Simon about himself, about his past, and the remorse he had felt for the hurt he had caused to a woman he had loved deeply. Darrell had left her, unaware of the shame that had befallen her. When he finally learned of her situation, he rushed to her side, but it was too late. She refused to be with him and had left him. He followed her west, but never found her. Simon leaned forward, studying Daryl's face, searching for any signs of regret. Without flinching, Daryl met Simon's gaze and began to speak. "You know how out here men somehow lose their old names and identities. It won't surprise you to learn that my name isn't really Daryl, as I once told you." Simon stiffened, sensing that there might be a strange mood to come. Daryl's heart bulged and contracted in his chest, and his body grew cold. It took tremendous effort to make his lips form words. "Simon, I'm the man you're hunting. I'm Edwards. I was Mona's lover." The old man rose and towered over Daryl, then plunged down upon him and clutched his throat with terrible, stifling hands. The harsh contact and pain woke Daryl up to his peril before it was too late. Desperate fighting saved him from being hurled to the ground and stamped and crushed. Simon seemed like a maddened giant. There was a reeling, swaying, wrestling struggle before the elder man began to weaken. Buffeted, bloody, and half-stunned, Daryl panted for speech. "Simon, hold on, give me a minute. I married Mona, didn't you know that? I saved the child." Daryl felt the shock that vibrated through Simon. He repeated the words again and again. As if compelled by some resistless power, Simon released Daryl and, staggering back, stood with uplifted, shaking hands. In his face was a horrible darkness. "Simon, wait, listen," panted Daryl. "I've got that marriage certificate. I've had it by me all these years. I kept it to prove to myself that I did the right thing." The old man uttered a broken cry. Daryl stole off among the rocks. He had no idea how long he was gone or what he did. When he returned, Simon was sitting before the campfire, and he appeared composed once more. His voice had a deeper note, but otherwise he seemed as usual. Together they packed the burros and faced the north. Daryl felt an overwhelming sense of joy. He had helped his companion carry a heavy burden, but in doing so had also lightened his own load. He no longer felt tormented at the thought of Mona. As he walked with his friend through the tranquil wilderness and rested beside him under the peaceful glow of the stars, Daryl began to sense the presence of unseen entities that were nonetheless very real to him. These phantoms whispered comforting words, and he felt a sense of tranquility that he had never experienced before. He heard their whispers in the rustling of the cool breeze and the gentle trickle of sand, as well as the distant rumble of rocks tumbling down a hillside, and even in the fleeting trail of a shooting star. The phantoms of peace spoke to him of the long suffering that men endure, and how it can ultimately be made bearable. Even in the harsh light of day under the scorching sun, Daryl could still hear their whispers. And in the stillness of the midnight hours he could feel them drawing closer on the desert wind, the voices of nature's motherly embrace, the whispers of God, and the peace found in solitude. Chapter 3. One morning the sun rose up in the sky looking fiery and red, but it was hard to see it clearly because of the dull haze that filled the air. Daryl noted that it seemed like they were going to face sandstorms soon. It wasn't long before a wall of yellow sand, stretching as far as the eye could see, descended upon them, and they quickly sought refuge behind a rock. They hoped that it was just a brief squall, which was common in the area, but their hopes were soon dashed as the moaning turned into a deafening roar, and the redness of the sun faded away, replaced by a thick veil of yellow sand that engulfed everything in its path. The air was now so heavy that it was hard to breathe. Simon removed the packs from the burros, while Daryl wondered if the sandstorms had arrived earlier than usual. They both covered their heads and waited patiently for the storm to pass. However, as time ticked by, the storm grew even more intense. To protect themselves from the sand that was flying around them, Daryl and Simon used water from their canteens to wet their scarves, which they then wrapped tightly around their faces before covering their heads again. Despite their efforts, the sandstorm's roar continued to echo around them, hollow and unrelenting. The sandstorm was so thick that it coated the blankets and almost buried the men beneath the shelving rock. They had to constantly shake off the sand to avoid being knocked to the ground and dig out their packs. As time passed, the floor of their shelter rose higher and higher. Eating was a struggle as they seemed to be grinding sand between their teeth. They lost track of time and could only huddle close to the rock, digging out their packs and gasping for air. Sleeping was not an option, as they feared being buried alive. Eventually the storm subsided, leaving the prospectors exhausted and their burrows missing or buried in the sand. The desert had transformed into a sea of sand dunes, with the peak to the north as their only guide. Carrying only a shovel and part of their packs, they headed towards the peak, trying to find water along the way. Simon, using a forked peach branch, was able to locate water, but it was too deep to reach. After a day of walking, they collapsed from exhaustion and slept through the night and part of the next day. When they finally found water, they filled their canteens and cooked a meal. Despite the scorching sun and the wide plain they found themselves in, they were careful with their water supply, drinking a little every hour. In the late afternoon, they came upon a canyon that they believed was the lower end of the one where they had last found water. They traveled for hours towards its head, and long after night had fallen, they finally found what they were searching for. Exhausted, they slept and were reluctant to leave the water hole the next day. The cool night gave them renewed strength with full canteens. Darrell realized they had turned back miles into the desert when morning arrived, and it was a desert he had not seen before. The red sun, increasing heat, and the size and variety of cactus plants warned him that he had descended to a lower level. Mountain peaks surrounded them, some near and others far away. One blue spur splitting the glaring sky to the north seemed familiar to Darrell, and he thought it was a landmark. The ascent towards it was not steep, but it was monotonous, stretching for leagues and leagues. Darrell knew there was only one hope to make the water last: never stop and rest. Simon began to weaken, often halting, and the burning white day passed, followed by a night of pitilessly bright stars. Darrell measured the water in his canteen by its weight, knowing that evaporation by heat consumed as much as he drank. During one of their rests, he poured a little water from his canteen into Simon's. At first, Darrell had accommodated his pace to that of his elder comrade, but now he felt that he was losing some of his instinctive and passionate zeal to get out of the desert. Water became the dominant thought in his mind, and he began to imagine that his last little store of water did not appreciably diminish. He knew he was losing his mind when it came to water, but it wasn't just a figment of his imagination, he was sure of it. As they rested, he pretended to be in a daze, but kept a watchful eye on Simon. The man seemed delirious, but still had his wits about him. Darrell saw him slyly pour water from his canteen into Darrell's own. This made him uneasy. He had always been irritated by Simon and his schemes. Darrell thought to himself that he should have known better than to trust Simon with his water. As Simon rested, Darrell took both canteens. He was disappointed to find that there was barely any water in Simon's canteen. They had both been suffering from the harsh desert conditions, but had been hiding it from each other. They had been sacrificing their own water for the other, but it had all gone to waste. Instead of quenching their thirst, the water had evaporated. Darrell took one last drink and gave the remaining water to Simon. He tossed his own canteen aside. A short while later, Simon realized his canteen was missing. "Where's your canteen?" he asked Darrell. "The heat got to my water, so I drank it all," Darrell replied. "My dear boy," said Simon. The day was a nightmare of red rocks and prickly cactus. The sun burned their skin like a flame. Simon was blinded by the glare, forcing Darrell to lead him. Eventually, Simon collapsed in the shade of a ledge, exhausted. Darrell stayed with him, feeling hopeless and exhausted himself. The ledge was like a step in a giant staircase. Below them was a sad and lonely valley. A faint streak of lighter color wound down the valley floor. It was once a river, but now only a trace remained. Darrell noticed movement out of the corner of his eye and saw that Simon had gotten up and was walking along the arroyo bed with his forked peach branch in hand. It seemed that the old prospector had regained his sight and some of his strength. Despite Simon's efforts, Darrell didn't hold much hope for finding water since the arroyo had been filled with sand by the desert winds. However, Simon stopped at a deep pit and began to cut his canteen in half and use one side of it as a scoop. Darrell tried to convince Simon to stop, but was unsuccessful. Simon worked tirelessly for what seemed like hours until the sand began to get damp and then wet. Water started to well up from the bottom of the pit, and Darrell was amazed at the amount of water they had found. With the dry season coming to an end, the discovery of water gave Darrell hope that they could survive. However, Simon had spent all of his energy and collapsed. Darrell moved him to a sheltered spot and noticed painted images on the wall while sitting beside him. In the desert, Darrell often stumbled upon remnants of a civilization that existed long before him. He picked up a rock out of habit and examined it closely. The weight of the rock caught his attention, causing him to look deeper. The color of the rock was black, and as he scraped through the rust, he found a piece of gold. Surrounding him were piles of black pebbles, weathered rocks, and broken ledges that also showed traces of gold. "Simon, look, see it, feel it, gold!" Darrell exclaimed. Unfortunately, Simon had never been interested, and now he was too blind to see. "Go," he whispered. Darrell gazed out into the valley, feeling something inside him that he couldn't quite describe. It was neither intelligence nor emotion, but something strange that impelled him to promise. After discovering the gold, he built stone monuments to mark his discovery. Once that was done, he stayed with Simon, who was unconscious. Time passed by, and Darrell still had enough strength to leave the desert. However, something held him back, making him stay with Simon. As he watched the sun set and the night fall, he felt a sense of comfort that he didn't need to fight sleep. The desert was silent, and Darrell sat vigil, looking out into the night. As the hours passed, a woman's face haunted Darrell's thoughts. He could feel that inscrutable something breathing around him, telling him that he was alone. He didn't need to look at the still face beside him to know that Simon was gone. The desert was silent, and the white night was full of shadows. The moon rose slowly, casting a melancholy glow across the desert. Darrell sat there, keeping watch over Simon's body. In the white moonlit shadows, a figure appeared, drifting in the darkness beyond. As it drew closer, it transformed into that of a young girl, sweet, with dark, haunting eyes like her mother's. Darrell prayed to the deep, mystical spirit within him, and to the nameless thing outside. The rocks, sand, cactus, lava, and endless waste that were but atoms in the grand scheme of things. He prayed for mercy for the woman and happiness for her child. In that moment, both mother and daughter were near him, and time and distance ceased to exist. Darrell had faith that he could see into the future and recognized the tragic threads of the past that led him to this forlorn desert. Taking a small tin box from his pocket, Darrell opened it and removed a folded certificate. He wrote something upon the paper with a pen, using his own blood as ink. In the moonlight, he could see well enough to place the box on a shelf of rock, where it would remain untouched by dust, moisture, heat, and time. Darrell marveled at the painted images that had remained clear and sharp on the dry stone walls for so long. He knew that there were no trails in that desert and that nature was always changing. The sands shifting, the floods digging, the ledges weathering, the cactus seeds rolling and splitting the soil with thirsty roots. Yet he could also see years passing and a child being led down into this forlorn waste where she would find love, fortune, and the grave of her father. Darrell shielded his companion's face from the dimming moonlight, disconnecting himself from the present moment. The world faded away from him, leaving him with a hazy awareness of his inner self. The passage of time blurred as the night turned into a colorless day and then back into a strange and eerie night. Suddenly, from the vast emptiness of the desert, Darrell's peaceful illusions emerged. They gathered around him in a grand and formal procession, offering him their tranquil and unemotional calm. Chapter 4. Richard Gale pondered on the fact that his time spent in the West had turned out to be exactly what his father had predicted. Aimless wandering with no clear objective. It was this realization, coupled with a hint of desperation, that led him to venture down to the border. Recent news of the Mexican Revolution, guerrilla warfare, and American cowboys fighting with rebels had piqued his interest, and he hoped to find some excitement there. Having had no luck finding his place in Montana, Wyoming, or Colorado, he decided to head southwest to Arizona, where he hoped to find some adventure. Upon arriving in Casita one dark October evening, Richard was taken aback by the bustling town. The train station was swarming with Mexicans, and he felt like he had stumbled into a foreign land. As he made his way through the well-lit streets lined with bright buildings, he encountered mostly Mexican locals. After a while, he managed to find a fellow American who agreed to help carry his luggage to a hotel. The guide told Gorman that Casita was split between Arizona and Mexico, with the majority of inhabitants residing on the Mexican side of the street, which acted as the boundary line. He also mentioned that rebels had stirred up some excitement in town earlier that day. Gorman, low on funds, opted for a cheaper lodging house instead of a fancy hotel, and even changed into more rugged attire. He mused to himself, "I'm almost broke. The governor said I wouldn't make any money. He's right so far. And he said I'd be coming home beaten. There he's wrong. I've got a feeling something will happen to me in this greaser town." Gorman stepped into a wide, whitewashed corridor that led to a massive room that resembled a courtyard, complete with pool tables, a bar, and benches. The cobblestoned floor and adobe walls added to the room's rustic charm, while large windows served as doors and allowed a blue cloud of smoke to fill the space. Gorman heard the sounds of pool balls clicking and glasses clinking at the crowded bar. He rubbed shoulders with bare-legged, sandal-footed Mexicans in white, as well as Mexicans in black and red. Some men wore tight-fitting blue uniforms with gold fringe or tassels at the shoulders and carried heavy bone-handled guns. They were the rurales, or native policemen. Black-bearded, coarse-visaged Americans could be seen gambling or drinking at little tables, while a rowdy crowd of younger men gathered around the pool tables, several of whom struggled to stay on their feet. Khaki-clad cavalrymen strutted in and out, adding to the lively atmosphere. In one corner of the room, away from the noisy crowd, 6 men gathered around a small table. 4 of them sat while the other 2 stood, catching the eye of Gorman. With their sharp features, tanned skin, piercing eyes, lean bodies, and cavalier attitude, it was clear that they were cowboys, even without their buckled sombreros, colorful scarves, and high-heeled boots with silver spurs. What surprised Gorman was the fact that they carried guns, which shattered his preconceived notion of the modern West. The rumors of fighting along the border seemed to have some truth to them, and Gorman was thrilled. Gorman satisfied his hunger at a nearby restaurant and was about to return to the saloon when a man wearing a military cape bumped into him. Both men apologized, but the stranger suddenly stopped and exclaimed, "John Gorman?" Gorman was surprised. "You got me, but I don't know you." He could not see the man's face, which was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger hurriedly pulled Gorman into the restaurant and removed his hat, revealing a handsome, sunburned face. "George Thorne, so help me," he exclaimed. Thorne cautioned Gorman to keep his voice down and not to draw attention because of reasons. He promised to explain in a minute. "Hey there, long time no see," exclaimed George as he greeted his old friend John. "It's been 5 years since I saw you run down University Field and take down the entire Wisconsin football team." John laughed and replied, "I don't remember that, but I'm sure glad to see you too. I heard you joined the Army, is that right?" "Yeah, I'm with the 9th Cavalry now," John confirmed. "But enough about me. What brings you way down here, and what's with the get-up? You're not getting into the mining or ranching business, are you?" John shook his head and replied, "Honestly, George, I don't even know why I'm here myself." His friend looked at him with concern and confusion. "What do you mean? Your family has too much money for you to be struggling. You didn't get into any trouble, did you?" John's emotions got the best of him as he realized how good it felt to have someone to talk to. "I don't know how I ended up here, George. I never really got along with my dad, and after trying and failing at everything he set me out to do, I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I was going west to start anew, and he laughed at me." George listened as John explained how he had no head for business and how his dad's constant criticism had caused him to lose what little ability he had. "I just couldn't take it anymore," John admitted. "So here I am trying to figure things out for myself." He called me a spoiled rich kid, lazy and spineless. He said I didn't have the guts to be truly bad and that I was too dumb to marry one of the nice girls my sister hung out with. He even went so far as to say that I couldn't make it back home without begging him for cash. The guy really let me have it. I couldn't help but feel a little ashamed as I dropped my head into my hands, trying to hide the sting in my eyes. Thorne, my friend, was having none of it. "What's wrong with that guy?" he exclaimed. "Didn't they call you Biff Gorman in college? You were one of the best men Stagg ever trained. You were the fastest 175-pound man he'd ever seen, the hardest to stop." I shook my head. The governor didn't count football. He meant a different kind of fight. When I left home, I didn't know what was wrong with me, but now I think I do. I was a spoiled, dependent rich kid who didn't know the value of a dollar. I don't think I have any real earning capacity, and I can't seem to do anything with my hands. That's the problem. But I've had enough. I'm going to punch cattle or maybe become a miner. Hell, I might even join the rebels." Thorne laughed. "I knew you were going to say that. But forget it, man. There's something happening in Mexico that the United States hasn't even realized yet. Over there are revolutionaries, soldiers who aren't getting paid enough, guerrilla leaders, raiders, outlaws, bandits, starving peasants, and women who are afraid for their lives. Mexico is like a volcano just waiting to explode with fire and brimstone. Don't be a fool and join the rebel forces. Mexicans of the lower class, the fighting class, hate Americans. These crazy greasers can't make up their minds which side they are on. They'll shoot you, starve you, or let you die of thirst. And if you survive all that, they'll still stab you in the back for your boots or belt buckle. There are some Americans fighting with the rebels, heading towards Agua, Prieta, and Juarez. Orozco is in Chihuahua, and he knows a thing or two about war. But this is Sonora, a mountainous desert, the home of slaves and Yaqui. There's chaos everywhere, with unorganized revolts breaking out all over. American miners and ranchers who could escape have fled across the border, leaving their property. Those who couldn't or wouldn't leave are fighting for their lives. Gorman was shocked when he heard this news. "Why doesn't the government do something?" he asked. "Because they're afraid of offending the Maderists or being criticized by foreign nations," I replied. "It's a delicate situation, and the officials in Washington know it. But the rest of the United States is in the dark about what's happening. We're patrolling the border, putting on a show of force. But I could tell you a dozen stories about how we should have chased raiders across the border, but we didn't. The officers are all in a bad mood these days. We're sitting on a powder keg, and we can't keep the rebels and raiders from crossing the border. But we also can't fight them. My commission is expiring soon." "I'll be out in 3 months, and you can bet I'm more than pleased about it," Thorne said, his demeanor betraying a certain level of suppressed excitement. Even as he spoke, his face remained pale beneath his tan, his eyes gleaming with a dark, fiery intensity. His delight at meeting and speaking with Gorman was apparent, but it was quickly overshadowed by his other emotions. Thorne took a seat at a table near one of the door-like windows that opened onto the busy street outside. Every so often he would glance out, checking the time on his watch. As he spoke with Gorman, these details gradually became more apparent. "George, you seem upset," Gorman said, noticing Thorne's agitation. "I remember you as a cool-headed fellow who was hard to ruffle. Has the army changed you?" Thorne laughed, a strange high-pitched sound that hinted at both recklessness and exaltation. Abruptly he rose from his seat, handing the waiter some money to fetch drinks. He peered out into the saloon, then back out into the street. On the other side of the house, a porch opened onto a plaza lined with trees and shrubs. Thorne moved quickly, peering out one window, then another. Returning to the table, he leaned in close to Gorman, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm AWOL," he said. "Isn't that a serious offense?" John was taken aback by his friend's intensity. "Serious? For you it could mean ruin. There are rebels in town, and at any moment we could find ourselves in trouble. You should be ready for duty at a moment's notice. If you're caught, it could mean arrest. That would delay your plans and ruin everything." Gorman fell silent, feeling the weight of his friend's words. Thorne leaned in even closer, his dark eyes searching Gorman's face. "We were old pals once," he said. "Surely," replied John. "John, I need your help. I want to get her to safety, to somewhere she'll be protected. I can't do it alone. Will you help me?" Thorne's eyes were desperate, pleading. John nodded firmly. "Of course I'll help you. What do we need to do?" Thorne leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. "We need to get her out of Casita without anyone noticing. I have a plan, but I need your help to pull it off." The two men set to work planning and scheming. They knew the risks were high, but they were determined to help this girl. They spent the next few days carefully carrying out their plan, watching over their shoulders for any sign of Rickards or his men. Finally, they succeeded. They got the girl out of Casita and onto a train heading north. Thorne stayed with her, protecting her and keeping her safe while John returned home, secure in the knowledge that he had helped a friend in need. As Thorne and the girl disappeared into the distance, John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and satisfaction. He had helped make a difference in someone's life, and that was all that mattered. Our conversation took place in the midst of chaos at the train station. No one seemed to be paying attention to us, or so I thought. I suggested to the woman, who was disguised as a nun, that she remove her costume before departing the waiting area. I arranged for a young boy to escort her out, but he ended up taking her to his own home instead. I promised to meet with her later that evening to discuss the situation further. When I finally laid eyes on her, I was absolutely smitten. Selena de la Rocha was the most exquisite woman I had ever seen. She came from an affluent Spanish family and had spent time living in both Europe and Cuba. She was well versed in both French and English, but I digress. It was love at first sight for both Selena and me. I devised a plan to marry her and whisk her away from the border and into the interior, but it would not be easy. We were both being watched, and it was impossible to see her without the other women in the house taking notice. At first they were only curious and eager to gossip, but something changed in the last few days. A powerful force seemed to be at work, and I suspected that Rickards and his gang of rebels were behind it. I took a risk and left camp to find a priest who could help us. The priest promised to come to the house, but I feared that he may be intercepted along the way. John suggested that we just get married without waiting any longer and without running any more risks. But I knew it was too late for that. I should have taken that chance the previous night. "We've crossed the line," Gorman said. "Are we in Mexican territory now?" "Yes, we are," Thorne replied. "And that's what makes this complicated. Rickards and his rebels have Casita under their control. Without his rebels, Rickards would be powerless against me, and I could easily get the girl and make our escape to the mountains. But Selena is being closely watched, and if her identity is discovered, we wouldn't make it far from this house before I was killed and she was taken." "Good God, Thorne," Gorman said in disbelief. "Can that really happen so close to the United States border?" "Yes, it can," Thorne replied. "You don't understand the power that these guerrilla leaders, rebel captains, and bandits hold over the Mexican people. In Mexico, a bandit is a man of honor. He is feared, envied, and loved. They stand next to the national idols like bullfighters and matadors. The Mexican people have a wild, barbaric, and bloody nature. Take Quinteros, for example. He was once a slave but became a famous bandit. When the revolution broke out, he declared himself a leader and devastated entire counties with his followers. The opposition to federal forces was just an excuse to rob, riot, and carry off women. Quinteros's motto was, "Let us enjoy ourselves while we may." "There are other bandits besides Quinteros, not as famous or great leaders, but just as ruthless," Thorne continued. "I've seen Rickards. He's a handsome, bold devil, more vain than any peacock. He adorns himself in gold and silver, wearing all the finery he can steal. He was one of the rebels who helped sack Sinaloa and made off with $500,000 in valuables and money. Rickards spends gold like he spills blood, but he's mostly known for abducting women. The peon girls see it as an honor to be taken by him." "Rickards sure likes himself some high-class ladies," Thorne muttered, wiping sweat from his face. He gazed out the window, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point. "Selena's in a bad spot. We're not getting any help from our side of the border. The population over there is mostly Mexican, and they're all in cahoots with the rebels on this side. The greasers on both sides are all on Rickards' side. They respect guys like him and hate aristocrats like Selena. They'd help him get his hands on her in a heartbeat. Rickards can use all the underground connections to his advantage. If I don't stop him, he'll get Selena as easily as lighting a cigarette. But I'll kill him or his gang or her before I let that happen. That's the situation, old friend. I'm in a tight spot. I'll probably get arrested for desertion soon. Rickards is in town, and I think I'm being followed. The priest might have betrayed me or been stopped. Selena's here alone, waiting for me to save her from... She's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. But there'll be hell to pay soon, one way or another. John, are you with me?" John Gorman took a deep breath, feeling a coldness and lethargy that had weighed on him for months dissipate. He couldn't speak, but he squeezed Thorne's hand tightly. Thorne's face transformed, his distress and fear replaced by a grateful smile. Suddenly, John's attention was drawn to a sound, and he looked over Thorne's shoulder to see a sneering, handsome face at the window. The dark eyes glittered with sinister intent. John tensed up. Thorne clenched his fists and turned towards the window. "Rickards," he muttered under his breath. The night was dark and cold, and he was enveloped in a thick blanket of silence. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area for any sign of movement. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. He had been tracking Rickards for weeks, and now he was close. He could feel it. This was his chance to finally catch the man who had eluded him for so long. He took a step forward, his breathing slow and steady. Suddenly a twig snapped under his foot and he froze. He listened intently, but there was no response. He continued forward, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. And then he saw him. Rickards. He was standing just a few feet away, his back turned. The man was tall and lean, with a shock of unruly hair that fell over his forehead. He wore a long coat that flapped in the wind, and his hands were stuffed deep in his pockets. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab Rickards by the shoulder. But before he could make contact, Rickards spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "What do you want?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. But then he remembered why he was there. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice steady. Rickards laughed, a deep guttural sound that echoed through the trees. "You'll never take me alive," he said, his eyes flashing with defiance. And then he was gone, sprinting through the darkness like a wild animal. He chased after him, his heart pounding in his chest. But it was too late. Rickards had disappeared into the night, leaving him alone with nothing but the sound of his own heavy breathing. Chapter 5. The dark face disappeared from view, and John Gorman could hear the distinct sound of spurs clinking against the ground. He walked towards the window just in time to see a Mexican swagger through the doors of the saloon. John only got a brief glimpse of the stranger, but he noticed the man's large black sombrero with a flashy band, the back of his short, tight-fitting jacket, a heavy pearl-handled gun that hung from a sash fringe, and his close-fitting trousers that flared out at the bottom. As John watched, he noticed other men walking down the street and several Mexicans loitering around the hitching rail nearby. Thorne approached John and whispered, "Did you see where he went? Those greasers out there with the cartridge belts crossed over their chests are rebels." "I believe he went into the saloon," replied John. "He had a gun, but I don't see any other armed Mexicans out there." "Don't be so sure, John. Look over there. That man is a guard, even though he seems relaxed. He's carrying a short carbine, almost hidden. There's another Mexican further down the path. I'm afraid Rickards has the house under surveillance." "If only we could be sure," John replied. "I'm positive, John. Let's go across the hall. I want to see what's happening on the other side of the house." Gorman followed Thorne out of the restaurant and into a high-ceilinged corridor that separated the hotel, leading to the street and a patio. Dim yellow lamps flickered, and a Mexican wrapped in a blanket stood in the front entrance. Shadows moved across the stone floor towards the patio. Thorne led them into a spacious room that was even darker than the hallway. It was furnished with a table covered in papers, high-backed chairs, and a couple of couches, and it was clearly a parlor. "Selina and I have been meeting here," Thorne explained. "At this hour she comes to the head of the stairs every so often, and when I'm here she comes down. Usually there are people in this room a little later. We go out to the plaza, which faces the dark side of the house. That's where I have to slip out with her if there's any chance of getting away." They peered out of the open window. The plaza was dark and seemed empty at first. However, Gorman soon spotted a dark form slowly pacing on the path. There was another one farther down. It didn't take much effort to see that they were stealthy sentinels. Thorne gripped Gorman's arm and whispered, "You saw them. It's just as I feared. Rickards has the place surrounded. I should have taken Selina away, but I didn't have the time or chance. I'm stuck. There's Selina now. My God. John, think if there's a way to get her out of this trap." Gorman turned around as Thorne went down the room. In the faint light at the head of the stairs, he saw the slim, muffled figure of a woman. When she saw Thorne, she silently flew down the stairway to him. He caught her in his arms, and she spoke softly, brokenly, in a low, swift voice that was a mixture of incoherent Spanish and English. To Gorman it was mellow, deep, unutterably tender, full of joy, fear, passion, hope, and love. It had an inexplicable effect on him, making him feel thrilled and wondering. Thorne led the girl to the center of the room, under the light where Gorman stood. She raised a white hand, holding a black-laced mantilla half aside. John saw a small, dark head, proudly held, an oval face half hidden, white as a flower, and magnificent black eyes. Then Thorne spoke. "Selina John Gorman, an old friend of mine, the best friend I ever had." She removed the mantilla from her head, revealing a stunning face, one that was unfamiliar to Gorman. It was intense and full of pride and fire. Senor Gorman, I cannot express my happiness. His friend. Yes, Selina, my friend and yours, said Thorne, speaking quickly. We'll need him. There's bad news, and we don't have time to sugarcoat it. The priest didn't come. He must have been held up. And listen, be brave, dear Selina. Rickards is here. She let out an unintelligible cry which shook Gorman's nerves. Thorne caught her and implored her to stay strong. My darling, please don't faint or fall apart. We'd be doomed. We have a chance. We'll figure something out. Be strong. Fight. Gorman could see that Thorne was in a frenzy. He didn't know what he was saying. Pale and trembling, he held Selina close to him. Her fear had rendered him powerless. It was so intense, so full of the horrible certainty of what awaited her. She cried out in Spanish, entreating him, and as he shook his head, she switched to English. Senor, my lover, I will be strong. I will fight. I will obey, but swear by my virgin, if necessary, to save me from Rickards, you will kill me. Selina, yes, I'll swear, he replied gruffly. I know I'd rather have you dead than... But don't give up. Rickards can't be sure of you, or he wouldn't wait. He's in there. He's got his men all around us, but he's hesitant. A brute like Rickards doesn't stand idle for no reason. I tell you we have a chance. John, here, will come up with a plan. We'll slip away. Then he'll take you somewhere. Just talk to him and show him that you won't waver. Selina, this is more than love and happiness for us. It's a matter of life and death, she said quietly, regaining her composure. Suddenly she turned to face Gorman with proud, dark eyes, a tragic sweetness in her appeal and exquisite grace. Sir, you're an American. You couldn't possibly understand the hatred and cruelty of the peon bandits with Spanish blood. I'd rather die than let Rickards lay a hand on me. If he captures me alive, the little time I have left will be filled with torture and hell. If I survive for 2 days, his brutal men will have their way with me. If I survive for 3, the dogs of his camp— She paused, pleading with Gorman. Sir, do you have a sister you love? Please help Mr. Thorne save me. He's a soldier. He's bound by honor and duty. He can't betray them for me. You two splendid Americans, so big, so strong, so fierce. What is that little black half-breed slave Rickards to such men? He's a coward. But I don't want to waste any more time. I'm ready. I'll be brave. She stepped close to Gorman, offering her white hands, a woman full of fire and soul and passion. To Gorman she was a wonder. His heart soared. As he bent over to kiss her hands, he felt a sense of renewal, of being remade. Miss, I'm honored to serve you. I can't think of anything better than giving you the help you need. And what is that? Asked Thorne anxiously. I'll take care of Rickards for tonight and maybe several nights to come, replied Gorman. John, what about you? I'll make a scene in that saloon, John replied bluntly. I'll start something. I'll rush Rickards and his gang. No, John, you can't do that. You'll be stabbed, Thorne interrupted, his distress evident in his eyes. I'll take my chances. Maybe I can surprise that slow bunch of Mexicans and get away before they know what's happened. You watch from the window and be ready. As the rowdy commotion erupted in the plaza, Gorman turned to Thorne and Selina and gave them clear instructions. When the chaos starts, those guys out there will flee into the saloon. You two slip out and head straight down the dark street. I'll catch up with you before you get too far. Thorne was taken aback but didn't say a word while Selina clung to him with white-knuckled hands and anxious eyes. Gorman then made his way to the corridor where he put on some heavy gloves, messed up his hair, and disheveled his collar. He intended to draw attention to himself so his 5'11" height and 180-pound frame were more noticeable. However, no one seemed to notice him as he entered the restaurant and moved through, stopping at the entrance to the saloon. The pool players were engrossed in their game while a group of Mexicans stood at the bar. Gorman soon spotted the man he believed to be Rickards, the notorious bandit. He recognized the man's massive black sombrero and ornate band, and noted that he was in a heated discussion with a dozen or so comrades at a table. They were drinking, talking, and listening intently. Gorman observed that they wore cartridge belts across their chests, confirming his suspicion that they were the rebels. He had seen the same belts on the guards outside. As a waiter brought more drinks to the table, the leader turned to face Gorman, revealing his sneering, sinister face.